Monster Hunter World Unpopular Opinions. Let's talk about them, shall we? Monster Hunter World is an incredibly successful game that took the world by storm. No pun intended there. That being said, there were changes that were made to the game that longtime fans of the series did not appreciate, and with just how popular the franchise has become with the release of this game, people are bound to have lots of opinions, and today we're going to be talking about the unpopular opinions. So I made a post in the community tab on YouTube asking you guys to leave your unpopular opinions about the game or the franchise. They can be about a mechanic, a specific game, or the whole Monster Hunter franchise in general, and this post got over 270 comments, so let's go over a few of them. Okay, so the very first comment we're going to take a look at says, "The handler in Monster Hunter World isn't actually that bad, she just is not trained for the field. Yes, I admit she is a tad annoying sometimes, but she ain't that bad." And honestly, I agree with this comment. A lot of people were hating on the handler for some reason, and I just don't see her as being that much of a nuisance. I mean, yeah, sure, she always ends up in trouble and she doesn't help you out a lot, and if you are a veteran player of the series, she often tries to give you advice, but it's usually some pretty basic advice, so nothing that she says you can learn from, because again, you are a veteran of the series. But I mean, if you have a problem with her, you can just turn the game audio to Japanese and she won't be as annoying. And hey, if you are on PC, you can change her face and many other things thanks to the power of mods, so there's always that. But it would be cool to get an option to remove all of the inputs you get from the different NPCs whenever you are on a quest. It can get annoying listening to the Admiral and to all of those NPCs talking while you are running the Kulve Taroth siege for the 100th time. I personally loved underwater combat and loved the challenge it brought and would be so happy to see it brought back. Like, it just ain't the same as a land-only fight. When I had the idea to make this video, I 100% knew that this was the one comment I was going to see for sure. As many of you already know, underwater combat is something that is very divisive in the Monster Hunter community. It was only present during the 3rd generation of Monster Hunter games, and even so, I think that Monster Hunter Portable 3rd didn't even have it. It was a really cool concept that I loved seeing for the first time in Monster Hunter Tri. Fighting Lagiacrus underwater was such a cool experience that I honestly can never forget. However, underwater combat could be somewhat frustrating. The mechanics were clunky, it was not too well developed, and it led to some weird bugs, and again, it was just frustrating to fight some of these monsters while you were underwater. But at the same time, some of these monsters that you fought underwater were either much cooler and more menacing when you were underwater, and there were some other monsters that you could only exclusively fight while underwater. And many of them were really cool and their fights were very unique. My guess is that underwater combat was cut from the games because, again, it was very divisive in the community, and it probably took a very long time to develop and implement in the various different games, and they would need to introduce monsters that you would have to fight underwater, so maybe they would have to make different sets of moves for whenever you would fight said monsters underwater, but also when you would fight said monsters on land, and they would have different animations. So it would end up being an extra load of work that may not pay off because, again, the community, a large portion of the community, didn't enjoy underwater combat. I personally have to say that I wasn't the biggest fan of underwater combat. Yes, it led to some great moments in the franchise, but because it made some fights very frustrating, I ended up giving up on Monster Hunter Tri as a whole. And I'm guessing that many other players did the same. But if the Monster Hunter team were to implement underwater combat in Monster Hunter World or any other Monster Hunter game that they might release in the future, and if they were to perfect underwater combat and make the mechanics more fun, more engaging, and not as frustrating, then I could see that being a good thing, and the community would be there to back up that decision. So while I am rooting for the return of underwater combat in a spectacular form, I don't see it as something that we should expect because of the bad taste it left on many people's mouths. Next comment. Hunting horn is the best weapon. I don't know why this is even here. That's not an opinion, that's just a fact. The quick select is janky. That feeling you get when you drink an ancient potion instead of sharpening with a whetstone. Here Emerald Sword is talking about the Radial menu, and I can see that as being a problem for some people. The default settings that come with the game for the Radial menu are very bad in my opinion, because they make it so that you have to release the analog stick at a right position to consume an item, whereas with the alternative settings that you can choose, which is what I have, you have to press the R3 button in order to consume an item, so you don't end up consuming one on accident when you release the analog stick and it tilts ever so slightly and ends up consuming an item other than the one you wanted to consume initially. That can be very frustrating, and it is why I ended up changing the default settings, and I recommend everyone to do the same. But that's definitely an unpopular opinion, because the Radial menu does help you out a lot, because you can be doing all sorts of things while you are playing in the game, and you can use the Radial menu to quickly access one of the items you have, or you can start combining items on the Radial menu, which is also very useful if you are a ranged user. For example, if you use a heavy bowgun and you are in the middle of combat reloading the weapon and you want to at the same time combine items to create something like cluster bombs, for example, let's just say that because that's what every heavy bowgun player uses, then you can do that without opening the options menu, scrolling down to the crafting list and then manually selecting one of the options from there. So while I may agree that it can indeed be a bit janky at first, especially if you have the default settings, I think that it ends up being a great quality of life change that we never had access to in the older games. So again, I recommend all of you, especially those of you that don't like the Radial menu, to change the settings and then come back to me and tell me what you feel about it and see if your experience with it has improved at all. I hate that everything is about the meta build, specifically how to do the most damage. When I build my sets, I build them based on a theme or overall utility. I wish more people appreciated the artistic effort that goes into these builds, even though they aren't the quote-unquote best. There were quite a few other comments here that also said that they disliked the meta builds and how many people seem to try to impose these builds as being mandatory. What I mean by this is that there is a very small percentage of the community, although a very vocal minority, that seems to shame other players because those players may not be running what is considered the meta builds, the builds that are capable of dealing the most damage. And while I am interested in those builds and I have some of them and I have even covered some of them on the channel, I also use many builds that are all about utility and being a support player, for example. I have plenty of support builds that I use very often. And I also think that there is this small subsection of players that will try to use these meta builds against some of the most encounters in the game, like Arc-Tempered Current for example, and they may end up failing because those builds are optimized for just DPS, they are not optimized for surviving some of these encounters. Everyone is entitled and free to play however they like, use whatever weapons they prefer to use, and no one should be shaming other players because of their weapon of choice or because the build they choose to run. Sure, if someone on your group chooses to go with a build that quite clearly will not work against the encounter you're trying to do, maybe you find a way to tell them that they should change something about the things they are doing. Maybe they are using something that quite simply does not work on their build. But the point I'm trying to get across is that people shouldn't just be antagonizing other people for running different builds, and it's all about having fun, and I think that this comment right here sums it up perfectly. You don't have to do all your hunts quickly, you can have fun on long hunts as well. There is a lot to unpack here, and there are arguments that are valid for both sides, and so I plan on making a video addressing this topic or this issue right here, so that is why I'm going to cut the conversation on this topic right now. So while I may be moving on to other opinions, trust me, there is more that I want to say about this specific topic. Get good is not an insult, it's literally how you will only get better at Monster Hunter. If you don't learn to adapt and adjust your playstyle, you simply won't win. Yes and no, I think that this is an oversimplification of what is happening. Yes, you certainly have to improve yourself, but if someone asks for advice and is having trouble with a certain encounter, maybe instead of just saying get good, someone could say, hey, have you tried using this other weapon? Maybe try using this type of element because that monster is weak to it, or maybe just try to hit the monster on the tail since he doesn't have a lot of attacks that cover the tail, something along those lines. So while yes, some players should not feel like get good is just an insult and they shouldn't feel attacked, maybe it's because society as a whole is moving on to a place where everyone is just being oversensitive, so I get why you're saying that get good is not an insult, and it definitely isn't, but if someone is trying to get some help, maybe there are better approaches as to how you do it. How about those bland weapon designs? Like, that's just lazy, especially since some are literally just hunks of metal labeled like Name Bash for example, slightly shaded yellow. It pisses me off how lazy Capcom was with the designs. And as you can see, I replied with, I don't think that's an unpopular opinion because I really don't. Myself and many other content creators and all kinds of players really have spoken about how disappointed they are with the weapon design in Monster Hunter World, especially when the older Monster Hunter games were very colorful and had these crazy over-the-top wacky weapon designs, and they are missing for the most part in this game. We have gotten a few silly weapons here and there that are mostly introduced as event weapons, like the Bristly Hammer or the Donny Craig Dual Blades, but other than that, we don't have a lot of variety and original designs for the weapons. I mean, just look at the hammers and the hunting horns especially. Those things all look the same for the most part. Hopefully we see that the Monster Hunter team is taking this into consideration and will improve the weapon design in Iceborne. Palicos suck and the game would be better without them. That's definitely an unpopular opinion. I don't think I've ever seen a Monster Hunter player saying that they would rather not have Palicos. I mean, sure, you can not bring them in your hunts if they bother you that much, but do they get in the way of anything? They are just there to help you, they are your companion. Sometimes they will hit you when you are asleep to wake you up and avoid an incoming monster attack. Sometimes they will heal your poison, give you buffs. I mean, they are very useful for the most part. And you even get to customize the damn cat. I was very surprised when I first played Monster Hunter World and I saw that you could customize your own Palico. That was something that you could never do before. Sure, you could kind of select which color and which pattern they would get in generations, but that was a bit different. Here you can full on create your own Palico with all of their patterns, you can change their tails, their eyes, everything, and I think they look adorable. Fatalis is overrated. I can see that. A lot of the community definitely hypes up Fatalis as this big, huge monster that is extremely difficult, and then there is all of the lore associated with that monster that says that it is a monster that brings about calamity, and even White Fatalis is a monster that is said to be capable of ending continents and countries, so the lore is very crazy when it comes to these monsters. But when you actually get to face Fatalis in the game, he isn't all that difficult. White Fatalis and Crimson Fatalis may be different because they are much more difficult in my opinion, and the fight is much cooler than the regular Fatalis, but regular Fatalis as is, the fight itself isn't all that special. That's actually why I would love to see Fatalis in Monster Hunter World at some point. I would love to see the developers picking up that monster and trying to improve it, giving it some new moves, making it faster and the overall fight much more difficult, and there's a lot of hints that the monster may be coming to the game in Iceborne, so hopefully we will see Fatalis there and it will be a much more engaging fight. Kulve Taroth is fun no matter how many times you do the siege. Oof, that's quite the unpopular opinion, isn't it? Subscribe if you're new to the channel and turn on show notifications if you don't want to miss an ounce of Monster Hunter goodness. If you want to vote on what my next Monster Hunter top 10 or top 5 video will be, then head on over to Patreon and become a patron like these beautiful people. A big thank you to my patrons for choosing to support me and helping me keep this channel alive. You guys are my heroes, and a special thank you to Guild Arts Gaming for being a mighty hero. With that being said, thank you all so much for watching. My name is DarkHero, and happy hunting!